The easiest way to judge a kingdom is not by how it honors its queen, but by how it treats the servant no one believes is watching. Dawn spread across Blackstone Citadel in ribbons of pale gold, washing over towering stone walls and silver banners that carried the ancient crest of the northern wolves. Everywhere the castle stirred with anticipation. Noble families arrived in polished carriages. Royal guards inspected every entrance with practiced precision. Florists carried baskets overflowing with white roses and moon lilies through marble corridors, while musicians rehearsed soft melodies that would soon echo across the great hall. In only 3 days, Alpha King Cain Ashford would officially present Lady Victoria Hawthorne as his future Luna before every allied pack in the kingdom. To the outside world, Victoria seemed flawless. She smiled with effortless elegance whenever noble guests approached, thanked advisors with graceful words, and carried herself with the quiet confidence everyone expected from a future queen. Every courtier praised her beauty. Every newspaper in the capital celebrated the approaching moon bond ceremony. Even visiting ambassadors whispered that no ruler could have chosen a more perfect companion. Yet perfection was strangely easy to maintain whenever everyone important happened to be looking. Far below the royal balconies, hidden behind polished kitchens and narrow service corridors, another day had already begun long before sunrise. Clara Bennet quietly folded fresh linen beside the laundry room, carefully smoothing every wrinkle before placing each stack onto a wooden cart nearly as tall as she was. Her simple gray servant's dress showed years of careful mending, but every stitch had been sewn neatly with patient hands. She greeted every cook, gardener, stable hand, and maid with the same warm smile, though many hurried past without noticing her at all. To most people inside Blackstone Citadel, Clara was simply another invisible servant whose name rarely mattered. She accepted forgotten tasks without complaint, covered extra shifts whenever someone became ill, and often stayed awake long after midnight making certain elderly workers reached their rooms safely before finally returning to her own small chamber beneath the eastern staircase. She never expected gratitude. Somehow that only made her kindness feel more genuine. High above the servant quarters, Cain stood alone beside the palace window overlooking the awakening city. The cool mountain breeze carried the familiar scent of pine through the open balcony doors, yet something restless lingered inside him. Every report placed before his desk described Victoria as compassionate, wise, and beloved by the people. Every advisor assured him the kingdom had never felt more hopeful about its future queen. Still, the certainty everyone else seemed to possess refused to settle inside his own heart. He admired Victoria. He respected her family. He appreciated everything tradition expected him to appreciate. But admiration felt strangely different from trust, and trust could never be borrowed from someone else's opinion. As another royal secretary entered carrying invitations awaiting the king's seal, Cain quietly closed the final parchment without signing it. His decision surprised even himself. Instead of confirming another ceremonial rehearsal, he calmly cancelled the afternoon procession and dismissed every escort assigned to accompany him. The guards exchanged puzzled glances but obeyed without question. No official announcement followed. No royal trumpets sounded across the courtyard. Before the castle fully realized its king had disappeared from public view, Cain Ashford stepped away from the throne, intending to witness his own palace exactly as it behaved when no one believed the Alpha King was watching. Somewhere below, Clara lifted another basket onto her shoulder, completely unaware that destiny had already begun walking silently through the same halls where everyone else still believed appearances mattered more than truth. The palace changed the moment the throne room doors closed behind the Alpha King, although no one realized he had not gone where the official schedule claimed he would be. Servants continued polishing marble floors, arranging silver candle holders, and carrying fresh flowers toward the grand hall, believing. Every royal eye remained focused on ceremony preparations. Cain walked alone through an older corridor rarely used by nobles, wearing a simple dark traveling cloak over his formal clothes so that anyone glancing quickly might mistake him for another senior officer. He wanted silence more than attention, because silence often revealed truths that speeches carefully concealed. As he crossed a narrow stone bridge connecting the royal residence to the service wing, he noticed something unexpected. Laughter echoed from below, but it was not joyful. Looking down into the courtyard, he saw Lady Victoria standing beneath a flowering arch surrounded by several noblewomen. Their elegant dresses shimmered beneath the morning sunlight while a pair of young maids stood nearby with lowered heads, holding baskets filled with freshly washed linens. Clara approached carrying another stack folded with careful precision, balancing the heavy load without disturbing a single sheet. She lowered her eyes respectfully before speaking. "Good morning, my lady. The linens for the guest chambers are ready." Victoria barely looked at her. Instead, she reached toward one embroidered pillowcase and examined it as though searching for an excuse. After several quiet seconds, she sighed with visible disappointment. "This stitching is uneven," she said calmly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Clara looked carefully at the fabric. Every thread appeared straight. Even one of the older housekeepers hesitated, seemingly surprised by the criticism. "I am sorry if I overlooked something," Clara answered gently. "I can repair it immediately." Victoria smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. "You always have another excuse. Perhaps if you spent less time helping everyone else, you would remember your own responsibilities." None of the noblewomen questioned the remark. A few offered polite smiles, eager to agree with the future Luna. Clara simply bowed her head. "I understand." She gathered the linens without defending herself and quietly carried them back toward the laundry room. Kane watched the exchange from the shaded balcony above. The mistake had been invisible even from where he stood, yet Clara accepted blame without argument. Curious, he continued following at a distance. Inside the laundry room, the elderly seamstress Margaret looked up with worried eyes. "Child, there was nothing wrong with your work," she whispered. Clara answered with the same gentle smile she offered everyone. "I know. But arguing would only make today harder for everyone." Before Margaret could reply, another servant hurried inside carrying a bucket that suddenly slipped from trembling hands. Fresh water spread across the stone floor, soaking several folded blankets prepared for visiting dignitaries. The young maid's face turned pale with panic. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "They will dismiss me." Without hesitation, Clara knelt beside her, lifting the blankets before the water reached the remaining stacks. "Do not worry," she said softly. "We still have enough time. We will wash them again together." She did not ask whose mistake it had been. She did not complain that her own work had already doubled. She simply rolled up her sleeves and began again. Hidden beyond the half-open doorway, Kane remained perfectly still. For the first time that morning, the reports praising kindness inside his palace no longer matched what he had witnessed with his own eyes, and a quiet question settled deeper within his heart than ever before. The remainder of the morning unfolded with the quiet rhythm expected before a royal ceremony, yet Kane no longer viewed the palace through the eyes of a king preparing for celebration. Instead, he watched as though he were a stranger searching for the truth hidden beneath polished marble floors and carefully rehearsed smiles. Remaining unnoticed proved easier than he had imagined. Most servants hurried from one task to another without lifting their eyes, while nobles paid little attention to anyone they believed unimportant. From the upper gallery overlooking the eastern courtyard, Kane observed Clara carrying baskets of fresh bread toward the kitchens. Halfway across the courtyard, she noticed the elderly gardener struggling to move several heavy clay pots filled with young pine trees that would decorate the entrance before the moon bond ceremony. Without being asked, she quietly placed her own basket beneath the shade of an archway and hurried over to help. Together they slowly carried each pot into position. The old gardener smiled with grateful relief, but Clara simply thanked him for allowing her to assist before returning to collect the bread. Only moments later she reached the palace kitchens, where another unexpected problem awaited her. A young kitchen apprentice stood frozen beside a large wooden table, staring helplessly at dozens of pastries that had burned after he lost track of time while delivering supplies. His shoulders trembled as he whispered that the desserts had been prepared especially for visiting nobles and that the head chef would never forgive such carelessness. Clara looked at the ruined pastries only briefly before gently placing a reassuring hand upon the frightened apprentice's shoulder. "Then we still have enough time to make another batch," she said with calm confidence. "I will help you." The apprentice stared at her in disbelief. "But you already have your own duties." Clara smiled softly. "Today belongs to everyone, not only to one person." Together they measured fresh flour, gathered butter from the cold pantry, and worked quietly beside the large stone ovens while sunlight streamed through the high kitchen windows. Cain remained hidden beyond the doorway, watching every movement. No one praised Clara. No one thanked her. Several workers accepted her help as though such kindness had become ordinary. That realization unsettled him more than anything else. A person could pretend to be generous once or twice, but habits revealed character more honestly than grand gestures. As the fresh pastries cooled upon wooden racks, Clara noticed one small loaf that had cracked while baking. Instead of discarding it, she wrapped it carefully in a clean cloth and slipped outside toward the stable yard. There she found a young orphan boy who often delivered feed for the horses but rarely entered the palace because he owned little more than patched boots and an oversized coat inherited from his older brother. Clara knelt beside him and offered the warm bread with an encouraging smile. The child's eyes widened with surprise before he thanked her with genuine happiness. She reminded him to share it with his younger sister waiting at home before quietly returning to her work without expecting anything in return. Cain watched the exchange from beneath the shadow of an old oak tree. At that same moment, elegant laughter drifted across the courtyard once again as Victoria crossed the garden surrounded by noble guests, accepting compliments with effortless grace. Every eye followed the future Luna. No one noticed the servant disappearing back through the kitchen entrance after making certain someone else would not go hungry. For the first time since announcing his engagement, Cain found himself wondering whether the palace had spent months admiring the brightest light while completely overlooking the heart that quietly illuminated everyone around it. The afternoon sunlight slowly softened as long shadows stretched across the palace gardens, but Cain refused to return to the throne room. Every hour spent away from ceremony preparations revealed another quiet truth no official report had ever mentioned. Instead of seeking conversations with nobles or advisors, he found himself drawn toward the places where servants gathered naturally, believing no important eyes would ever notice them. Near the western courtyard, several stable hands rested briefly beside the old stone well after unloading wagons filled with supplies for the coming celebration. Their voices remained low, careful, yet surprisingly honest. One older stable master smiled as Clara passed carrying fresh blankets toward the infirmary. "There goes the only person in this palace who remembers every birthday," he said warmly after she disappeared around the corner. Another servant nodded with quiet admiration. "When my wife became sick last winter, she visited every evening after finishing her work. She brought soup, herbs, and books for the children. She never allowed anyone to thank her." A younger groom hesitated before asking the question that silenced the group. "If everyone respects her so much, why is she always blamed whenever something goes wrong?" No one answered. Immediately. Finally the oldest servant lowered his voice. "Because kindness rarely argues for itself." Hidden behind the ivy-covered wall, Cain remained perfectly still. He had expected complaints, gossip, or resentment. Instead, he heard genuine affection spoken without expectation of reward. Yet something else caught his attention. Throughout the entire conversation, no one praised Victoria unless her name was mentioned first. When it was, smiles quietly faded and careful silence replaced easy conversation. The difference felt impossible to ignore. Curious, Cain continued through another corridor leading toward the palace library, where several maids arranged fresh flowers beneath tall stained glass windows. As soon as Clara entered carrying clean table linens, the atmosphere subtly changed. One maid who had accidentally torn her apron earlier that morning quickly hid the damaged fabric behind her back. Clara noticed immediately. Without embarrassment or unnecessary questions, she reached into the small sewing pouch attached beneath her apron and handed over matching thread with a gentle smile. "You can mend it during supper," she whispered. No one else needs to worry. The relieved maid thanked her quietly before returning to work. Only moments later Victoria entered with 2 visiting noblewomen touring the palace before the ceremony. Every servant straightened instantly. Victoria accepted their bows gracefully while complimenting the beautiful decorations surrounding the library. She spoke elegantly about loyalty, compassion, and the importance of treating every member of the household with dignity. Her words sounded flawless. The visiting guests exchanged impressed smiles, clearly believing they stood before an ideal future queen. Kane watched from the upper gallery, listening carefully. The speech itself contained nothing false. Yet something felt strangely rehearsed. As soon as the guests continued toward the next hallway, Victoria's pleasant expression disappeared almost effortlessly. She glanced toward the flower arrangement nearest the entrance and calmly informed the nearest maid that the colors looked disappointing before instructing her to replace every bouquet before sunset. The maid quietly accepted the impossible assignment despite already being overwhelmed with other preparations. Clara stepped forward almost instinctively. "I can help after I finish the infirmary," she offered softly. Victoria looked at her for only a moment before replying, "Perhaps if you completed your own responsibilities more efficiently, you would not constantly need to involve yourself in everyone else's." Clara simply lowered her head. "Yes, my lady." She turned away without resentment, gathering her linens once more. Kane noticed something he had overlooked before. Every time Clara was criticized, she became gentler. Every time Victoria was praised, she became colder once the audience disappeared. Standing alone beneath the fading afternoon light, the Alpha King realized that certainty was slowly slipping away, replaced by a question that could no longer be silenced. If the entire kingdom had mistaken performance for character, then the greatest mistake of his reign might still be waiting just ahead. As evening settled over Blackstone Citadel, hundreds of lanterns gradually illuminated the palace grounds with a warm golden glow, preparing the castle for another night of endless rehearsals before the moon bond ceremony. Musicians practiced inside the grand hall while servants hurried through endless lists of unfinished duties, each believing tomorrow would bring even greater demands. Kane quietly remained beyond the notice of the royal court, unwilling to abandon the questions growing heavier within his heart. Rather than returning to his private chambers, he slipped into the records office adjoining the Eastern Gallery, a place where inventories, ceremonial objects, and household supplies were carefully documented before every royal celebration. There, an unexpected idea quietly formed. Without informing anyone except the elderly chief steward, Kane requested that one ceremonial item be removed from its assigned display before sunrise. It was an ancient silver brooch bearing the royal wolf crest, a treasured heirloom traditionally fastened to the future Luna's ceremonial cloak during the final rehearsal. The steward looked confused but obeyed without hesitation. The brooch was placed inside a plain wooden box and hidden inside a nearby cabinet, while only a single note remained stating that the item had not yet been located. Kane intended no humiliation. He simply wished to observe how people responded when uncertainty entered a situation no one had rehearsed. The following morning, quiet concern spread through the palace far more quickly than expected. Several attendants searched display rooms, ceremonial wardrobes, and storage chests, hoping someone had merely misplaced the heirloom. Before long, whispers reached Victoria. She entered the preparation chamber with calm authority, surrounded by 2 noble companions and several senior servants. Her expression remained perfectly composed until the chief steward explained that the royal brooch could not be found. Silence filled the room. Then Victoria slowly turned toward the assembled staff. Her eyes paused only briefly before resting upon Clara, who had just arrived carrying freshly pressed ceremonial robes. "You organized the garments yesterday," Victoria said evenly. "Did you move the brooch?" Clara looked genuinely surprised. "No, my lady. I have never handled it." Victoria folded her hands gracefully. "Interesting. Then perhaps someone else remembers seeing it after you finished working." No one answered. Several servants exchanged uneasy glances, uncertain whether speaking would help or worsen the situation. A young maid standing beside the wardrobe suddenly lowered her head, her hands trembling almost imperceptibly. Cain noticed her immediately from the narrow balcony overlooking the chamber. Clara noticed her as well. After a brief silence, Clara quietly stepped forward. "If my presence caused any confusion, I accept responsibility for the misunderstanding," she said gently. "Please allow me to search every storage room until the brooch is found." Victoria regarded her with cool satisfaction. "Very well. The rehearsal cannot continue while such carelessness delays the household." As the gathering dispersed, the frightened young maid hurried after Clara into the corridor, tears gathering in her eyes. "Miss Bennet," she whispered, "it was my fault. I moved the empty display cloth yesterday while cleaning. I thought perhaps someone else had already taken the brooch. I was afraid they would dismiss me if I admitted it." Clara smiled with quiet reassurance. "Then do not carry that fear alone. We will keep searching together. No one deserves to lose hope over an honest mistake." She never mentioned that everyone already believed she was responsible. Hidden nearby, Cain listened to every word. Before he could step away, the elderly chief steward entered carrying the plain wooden box. "Forgive the interruption," he announced. "The royal brooch has been located exactly where His Majesty instructed it to be secured for safekeeping." The room fell completely silent. Victoria's composed smile faltered for only the briefest moment before returning. Clara simply thanked the steward that the treasured heirloom had been found. She did not defend herself. She did not reveal that suspicion had fallen upon her. She only looked toward the relieved young maid and offered the smallest reassuring smile. Standing unseen beyond a carved stone archway, Cain felt something shift inside him with undeniable clarity. For the first time, he no longer questioned whether Clara possessed extraordinary character. Instead, he began questioning how many times he himself had mistaken quiet goodness for ordinary service while allowing polished appearances to define the woman he intended to crown beside him. That evening a gentle rain settled over Blackstone Citadel, covering the stone courtyards with a silver shimmer that reflected the glow of hundreds of lanterns hanging beneath the palace arches. Most nobles had already retired to their luxurious guest suites, believing the final ceremony would proceed exactly as planned. Cain, however, had abandoned every remaining rehearsal. The questions that had quietly followed him throughout the past 2 days refused to leave his thoughts. Instead of returning to the royal residence, he walked alone through the service corridors once more, following no schedule except quiet instinct. As he approached the eastern kitchen, faint voices drifted through a partially opened doorway. Curious, he remained unseen beneath the shadow of the corridor. Inside, several servants hurried to prepare late evening meals for guards assigned to the outer gates. Clara stood beside the long wooden table, carefully wrapping fresh bread and warm stew into baskets for the night patrol. Although she had already worked since before sunrise, exhaustion never appeared in her expression. She thanked every cook who handed her another loaf, smiling with the same gentle kindness she had shown all day. Moments later, Victoria entered unexpectedly with one of her closest noble companions. She had apparently come to inspect the final preparations before tomorrow's royal banquet. The busy kitchen instantly fell silent. Every servant lowered their head respectfully. Victoria slowly surveyed the room before noticing one of the youngest kitchen assistants accidentally dropping a polished silver serving tray onto the floor. The loud sound echoed across the stone walls. The frightened girl immediately bent to retrieve it, apologizing over and over with trembling hands. Victoria's voice remained calm, but noticeably colder than before. "Carelessness has no place inside a royal household," she said. "If guests witnessed such behavior tomorrow, they would remember incompetence instead of excellence." The young assistant looked as though she might cry. Before anyone else could speak, Clara quietly stepped forward. "My lady," she said respectfully, "I asked her to carry more than she should have. The mistake is mine." The kitchen fell completely silent. Several servants looked toward Clara with quiet disbelief because everyone present knew the statement was untrue. Victoria studied her for several long seconds before answering, "Then perhaps tomorrow you should remain away from the ceremonial halls. I would rather avoid unnecessary distractions while distinguished guests are present." Clara simply bowed her head. "As you wish." Victoria turned gracefully and left the kitchen without another word, her companion following close behind. Only after the doors closed did the young assistant begin quietly crying. "Why did you do that?" she whispered. "Everyone saw it was my fault." Clara offered her a reassuring smile while placing another basket into the girl's hands. "Because one difficult day should never decide someone's future," she answered softly. "Tomorrow you will have another chance, and that matters more than proving who was right today." Cain remained motionless outside the doorway. The words settled heavily within him because they stood in sharp contrast to everything he had witnessed from Victoria. One woman protected her reputation whenever possible. The other willingly surrendered her own without hesitation if it meant preserving someone else's hope. As Clara finished preparing the final basket, she noticed a small injured wolf pup curled beneath the kitchen staircase, shivering from the cold rain after somehow wandering into the palace grounds. She gently knelt, wrapped the frightened animal inside a clean linen cloth, and carried it toward the warm hearth before asking one of the healers to examine its injured paw. She treated the tiny creature with the same quiet compassion she offered every servant, child, and stranger she encountered. Watching from the darkness, Cain finally understood why every ordinary worker spoke Clara's name with genuine affection while every compliment surrounding Victoria seemed to vanish the moment important guests walked away. The palace had spent months celebrating elegance, but hidden beneath its own roof lived a woman whose kindness required no audience at all, and for the first time since announcing his engagement, the Alpha King felt the painful certainty that the greatest mistake of his reign had not yet been made, but it was now close enough for him to see it clearly. The morning of the moon bond ceremony arrived beneath a clear blue sky, and Blackstone Citadel awakened long before sunrise. Bells echoed across the ancient towers while servants hurried through polished hallways carrying flowers, silver trays, and ceremonial banners embroidered with the royal wolf crest. Every corner of the palace shimmered with expectation because by nightfall the kingdom believed it would witness the official union between Alpha King Cain Ashford and Lady Victoria Hawthorne. Cain stood alone. Inside the private council chamber, dressed in the formal black ceremonial coat reserved only for kings, yet his attention remained fixed on the palace grounds outside the tall windows rather than the celebration awaiting him. During the past several days he had watched countless conversations unfold without anyone realizing he was listening. Every observation had pointed toward the same uncomfortable truth. Still, a king could not change the course of an entire kingdom based only upon quiet impressions. He needed certainty. He needed one final answer that no appearance, reputation, or rehearsed performance could disguise. Before the morning gathering officially began, Cain summoned the elderly chief steward with a single confidential instruction. Every servant assigned to the Grand Hall would receive an unexpected change in responsibilities. No explanations would be offered. The assignments would simply arrive moments before guests entered the palace. The steward bowed respectfully and quietly carried out the order. Within the hour, confusion spread through the household. Footmen exchanged duties with attendants. Kitchen workers were redirected toward guest reception. Flower arrangements were moved between halls. No task became impossible, but everyone was forced outside familiar routines. Cain watched from the upper balcony overlooking the central courtyard. Victoria immediately approached the steward, demanding an explanation for the sudden changes. Although her words remained courteous, frustration gradually appeared beneath her polished smile. She insisted the ceremony depended upon perfect organization and questioned why unnecessary adjustments had been introduced at the last moment. Across the courtyard, Clara received her own revised assignment. Instead of preparing linens inside the service wing, she was instructed to assist elderly guests arriving from distant territories. Without asking why the schedule had changed, she simply accepted the list, gathered fresh blankets for anyone traveling in the cool morning air, and quietly walked toward the front entrance. As the first carriages arrived, an elderly couple struggled to descend the carriage steps. After their long overnight journey, Clara immediately offered her arm, carried their luggage without hesitation, and guided them toward warm refreshments before directing another servant to prepare comfortable seats near the fireplace. A few minutes later, one distinguished noblewoman realized she had misplaced a treasured family pendant somewhere between the carriage yard and the entrance hall. Anxiety spread quickly among her attendants. Without drawing attention to herself, Clara retraced the woman's path through the courtyard until she discovered the small silver pendant resting safely beneath a stone bench. She returned it with both hands and a grateful smile spread across the elderly woman's face. Not once did Clara mention that the discovery had delayed her own responsibilities. Meanwhile, Victoria continued expressing concern over every unexpected adjustment, reminding attendants that distinguished guests expected flawless execution from the future Luna. Hidden among the arriving visitors, Kane quietly compared both women once again. One measured success by maintaining perfect appearances. The other measured success by making certain every person around her felt seen, welcomed, and protected. As the palace doors slowly opened to receive the full assembly of nobles, elders, and royal families, Kane felt the final uncertainty disappear from his heart. The answer he had been searching for had never been hidden inside ceremonies, titles, or noble blood. It had quietly revealed itself through every ordinary moment that no one else believed important, and standing beneath the ancient banners of his ancestors, the Alpha King finally knew that before the day ended, the destiny of the kingdom would change forever. The Grand Hall stood in complete splendor as representatives from every allied territory filled the polished rows beneath towering crystal chandeliers. Ancient banners bearing the royal wolf crest hung between marble columns while musicians played a solemn melody that echoed through the magnificent chamber. Every noble believed they were about to witness the final blessing before the moon bond ceremony. Victoria stood near the ceremonial platform, wearing an elegant silver gown that reflected the candlelight with effortless grace. Confident smiles surrounded her from every direction. Across the hall, Clara quietly remained among the palace attendants, ensuring elderly guests were comfortable, guiding children toward their families, and replacing empty cups before anyone needed to ask. She never looked toward the platform because she believed the ceremony belonged to people far above her place in the kingdom. When the royal herald announced the arrival of Alpha King Kane Ashford, every voice fell silent. Kane entered wearing the ceremonial black coat of his bloodline, his expression calm yet noticeably more thoughtful than during previous public appearances. He accepted the respectful bows of nobles before stepping onto the raised platform. The High Elder began the traditional blessing, speaking about loyalty, wisdom, compassion, and the sacred responsibility carried by those chosen to lead the kingdom. When the blessing concluded, the elder respectfully turned toward Kane. "Your Majesty," he said warmly, "if your heart remains certain, we may proceed with the final declaration before the moon witnesses your union." Instead of answering immediately, Kane slowly looked across the crowded hall. His gaze moved beyond decorated nobles, beyond visiting dignitaries, and beyond the ceremonial banners until it rested upon the quiet servant standing near the entrance, helping an elderly guest adjust a heavy traveling cloak. Clara finished assisting the woman before stepping backward, hoping to disappear once more into the background. Kane spoke at last, his calm voice carrying effortlessly throughout the silent hall. "Before any declaration is made, there is something this kingdom deserves to hear." Confused whispers spread among the guests. Victoria maintained her composed smile, believing perhaps the king intended a formal speech honoring tradition. Kane continued without raising his voice. "For many years I believed leadership could be measured by reputation, noble birth, and flawless appearances. During the past several days, I chose to walk through this palace without announcing my presence. I listened instead of speaking. I observed instead of judging." The hall became perfectly still. Kane slowly turned toward Victoria. "Lady Victoria, you have always presented yourself with elegance worthy of admiration. Yet I repeatedly witnessed kindness disappear whenever applause was absent." Her confident expression finally faltered. Before anyone could react, Kane looked toward the servants gathered beside the entrance. "I also witnessed another person. Someone who accepted blame to protect others. Someone who served without expecting recognition. Someone who treated every child, elder, servant, stranger, and even the smallest frightened creature with the same quiet compassion. Hundreds of eyes instinctively followed his gaze until they settled upon Clara. She looked behind herself in confusion, believing he must be addressing someone else. Cain descended the platform one deliberate step at a time until he stood only a few feet away from her. The entire hall watched in stunned silence as the Alpha King bowed his head with genuine respect before the palace servant. Gasps swept across the chamber. Clara's eyes widened with disbelief as she instinctively stepped backward. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "please, everyone is watching." Cain offered the gentlest smile anyone present had ever seen upon their king's face. "That is exactly why I could no longer remain silent." In that breathtaking moment, the kingdom realized the ceremony they expected had ended before it had truly begun, and the truth that had quietly lived within the palace walls was finally standing in the full light for every soul to witness. Silence lingered inside the grand hall long after Cain's words faded into the towering ceiling, as though the palace itself had forgotten how to breathe. Nobles exchanged uncertain glances while servants stood frozen in disbelief, unable to understand what they had just witnessed. Clara remained motionless, her hands still folded respectfully before her, her eyes filled not with pride but with quiet confusion. She had never imagined becoming the center of attention, especially not before the entire kingdom. Cain slowly straightened and faced the assembled court once again. His voice remained calm, steady, and impossible to misunderstand. "Today I have learned a lesson no royal education ever taught me. A crown does not reveal character. It only reveals what already lives inside the heart." He turned toward Victoria with the same dignity he had shown throughout the ceremony. "Lady Victoria Hawthorne, I do not question your intelligence, your accomplishments, or the years you have devoted to preparing for this role. But I can no longer promise a future built upon appearances when I have witnessed a different truth with my own eyes." Victoria lowered her gaze for several quiet seconds. For the first time since arriving at court, she offered no carefully prepared reply. The confident smile that had always protected her reputation simply faded away, replaced by thoughtful silence. Cain continued, not with anger but with unmistakable honesty. "Therefore, I cannot continue with the moon bond ceremony." A wave of astonished whispers spread throughout the chamber, yet no one interrupted their king. The High Elder slowly nodded, as though recognizing that the greatest decisions were not always the easiest ones. Cain then looked toward the gathered servants. "There is another truth this kingdom deserves to recognize. For years, many among you have quietly carried burdens without praise. One person chose compassion over recognition every single day, believing no one important would ever notice." Clara instinctively shook her head. "Your Majesty, I only did what anyone should do." Cain smiled gently. "That is exactly why it mattered." The elderly gardener stepped forward first, followed by the stable master, the kitchen apprentice, the frightened young maid, Margaret the seamstress, and finally the orphan boy holding the same patched coat Clara remembered from only days before. One after another, they shared simple stories of kindness she had long forgotten because she had never performed those acts to be remembered. The hall gradually transformed. Nobles who had once overlooked the palace servants listened with quiet respect. Several lowered their heads in reflection, realizing how easily they had mistaken status for worth. Clara's eyes filled with grateful tears, not because she stood before the royal court, but because every person she had tried to protect now stood beside her without fear. Cain removed the ancient silver brooch bearing the royal wolf crest from the ceremonial table and placed it carefully into Clara's hands. "This is not a promise of marriage," he said warmly. "It is a promise that goodness will never again be invisible inside this palace." Clara accepted the brooch with trembling hands before answering with the same humility that had always guided her life. "Then let it remind all of us, including me, to deserve such trust every single day." Warm applause slowly echoed through the hall until it filled every corner of Blackstone Citadel. It was not the celebration anyone had expected that morning, but it became the one the kingdom would remember for generations. From that day forward, the palace changed in quiet ways. Servants were greeted by name. Their voices were heard. Their work was respected. Cain delayed every discussion of choosing a future Luna because he understood that true partnership could never be rushed. He first wished to build a kingdom where character mattered more than appearance. As for Clara Bennett, she returned to her ordinary duties the very next morning, still greeting strangers with the same gentle smile that had always defined her. The difference was that this time, when she walked through the palace corridors, no one looked past her anymore, because the Alpha King had reminded an entire kingdom that the brightest light is often found in the person who never asks to stand in it.